Our third panelist today is Dr. Shinju Fujihira. He's a lecturer in political science at Tufts and teaches courses on comparative politics, comparative political economy, and politics in Western Europe and Japan. His research interests focus on the political economy of national security, comparative politics of advanced industrial democracies, and Japanese political economy and national security. His book manuscript, Conscripting Money, Democratization, Financial Power, and State Building in World Politics, investigates the effects of political regime types on financial power creation and examines the cases of Imperial Japan, Imperial and Nazi Germany, Imperial and Soviet Russia, Great Britain, and the United States since the late 19th century. He also serves as the Associate Director on the Program of U.S.-Japan Relations at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University.
Should I move over here just that it's not blocking his presentation?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Rithwik, and also Philip and all the organizers. I really admire the students who organize these very important symposium. And this also happens to work perfectly for my schedule of dropping off my son at Medford High School for my Japanese, for his Japanese school, and filing my income taxes. The title I came up with, given the topic, is Can Japan Build Strategic Trust with China? The starting point, I would start with a quote by a controversial Japanese ambassador to China over the last 2 years, Uichiro Niwa, who was the first non-foreign ministry, non-diplomat ambassador to China, and a business person, a major business person, pro-China, I would say, or at least perceived. I mean, I think he would dispute that perception. And here, as you can read the quote, I think the key here is that the two countries cannot change their physical addresses and move elsewhere. And so reading this, so we are more than married. Actually, this did not really, whenever you have a husband and wife analogy, I get kind of nervous. There have been instances in which actually husbands have killed wives and so on. But anyways, we don't want to get into that. We certainly do not want to get into that. But again, this is it's sort of as a rough translation of the interviews. But I think this is kind of a starting point. The term, strategic trust was mentioned. I guess it was the Brookings report which was mentioned. And this term actually has been being started to use in the U.S.-China context. And in the last few years. So for example, Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the New York Times op-ed, used this term, strategic trust, and you can again read this quote. And basically the argument he makes is it's kind of what has already been said, which is to say that distinguish between areas that the two countries can agree and disagree, and also number two, keep on talking. So acknowledge that conversations are going to be unpleasant. That is your starting kind of expectation, but keep on talking. And I have no illusions with regards to, and this is, he is pictured here with General Chen Minda. And I have no illusions that, of course, this is U.S.-China relations. And so my sort of question that I pose, given the topic of the panel, is whether this, to some extent, a move towards this direction with regards to Japan is possible. And of course, this use of the term strategic trust is actually, very commonly used these days. So this was used in a kind of a tryout for, then Vice President Xi Jinping in February of 2012, in which he actually makes a kind of a social science point in this speech, in which he says, I sort of, have a italicized version of the argument is that greater trust will lead to broader cooperation, and again emphasis on exchanges, communication, and the social science point that he is making in this statement is to say that actually trust comes first, that trust can be built, that again you could sort of read this by saying trust is not entirely endogenous to or entirely depending on the strategic and economic and political context. And my argument would be that in the Japanese context, as the previous presenter has argued, that I think it's somewhat similar in a sense that the causality really does depend on the strategic and economic and political context. But I would say that I would also highlight some of the efforts which actually do not get often reported in the Western media. And so I'll talk in that order, strategic, economic, and political. And I know that I'm standing between you and the lunch, so I'll try to be very quick. So the first, the other thing I should say is that the term strategic has been used in China-Japan relations since 2006. Not the term trust, but this phrase, which actually has become an important phrase, strategically, mutually beneficial strategic relationship since the first cabinet of Abe in 2006 when Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing at the time. And so that sort of is a starting point. So in terms of the military, as you can expect, military and also disputes in South China Sea, which I'll be happy to take questions. This is the most difficult part, which is that China's defense budget, the official figure, surpassed Japan's in the year 2004. China's GDP surpassed Japan's in the year 2010 in nominal terms, and China's spends about roughly 2% of GDP on defense. Japan spends a little less than 1% and so on. So there is this perception that, of course, the balance of power is shifting in favor of China and is not really favorable to Japan. So Japan's perception is that whether in the form of fishing boats, in which hundreds of fishing boats. One thing about the September 2010 crawler incident, the Cauldron incident, which needs to be emphasized, it's not that one crawler captain kind of rammed into Japan Coast Guard ship. It was actually, there were hundreds of fishing boats, or more than 100, I would say, not hundreds, but more than 100. So that, again, led to some complications. And of course, this kind of a scene in which you have two maritime agencies, so the Japan Coast Guard, the JCG, and the CMS, kind of, sort of chasing each other, not for minutes, but literally hours, all day. This kind of scene is actually very common these days. So Japan's perception with regards to China is that China is deploying fishing boats, civilian maritime fleets, and increasingly naval vessels in areas within East China Sea, and this actually is how sort of the way in which Japan has a sense of insecurity and distrust. However, it's also important to note that there also have been efforts in the mid-2000s to try to develop some level of strategic trust. So a major instance, for example, was August of 2007, when for the first time China's defense minister visited Japan for confidence building. And then for the first time in June of 2008, there was a port of call by the Maritime Self-Defense Force destroyer in southern port of Zhanjiang. So there were efforts to try to build this trust. All of this has been now suspended because of the problems in East China Sea. But it's very important to emphasize that there had been efforts in the mid to late 2000s to do this. And those two were very important instances of an effort. Again, people would say, well, this is just a start. Yes, the results are pretty modest. But these were very important instances in which the two countries tried to build relationships with the two militaries, which, of course, given Japan's history in China, with China, this is a very sensitive issue. So that is a kind of a very brief story about the military. In terms of economics, this is where, when you think of the comprehensive aspect of Japan-China relations, this is a place where it's the most promising, but I think there's increasingly a sense that Japan is becoming dependent on China. So in 1993, so 20 years ago, roughly, for China, so Japan's trade for China was 20% of China's trade, while China's share for Japan was 10%. So in other words, 20 years ago, Japan was much more important for China than vice versa. Now it's completely reversed. So now Japan's share in China's trade is 10%, and Japan's share in China's trade is 10%, and now China's share in Japan's trade is 20%. Okay, and this again is clearly an indication that Japan really does depend on China's growth in order to sort of revive its economy, exports to China is very important. And I guess a couple of other things to think about is if you think about auto sales of major auto companies, and I have other statistics, but I'll just give you some numbers. Total sales of Nissan in the world, a quarter, 25% takes place in China. For Honda, it's so 25% for Nissan, 20% for Honda, 12% for Toyota. Okay, so this is a degree to which, despite the strategic challenge from China, that China is a very important part of Japan's business strategy. What you hear today, particularly in the last few years, given the East China Sea sort of disputes, is this term China plus one. Japan must find another market. It could be Vietnam, it could be Myanmar, it could be Cambodia, obviously Thailand, Malaysia, and so on. So either as a destination of foreign direct investment or market, Japan must find another alternative because it's too dependent on China. But these efforts would be, I think there will be some limits to these efforts. And finally, I would say there's a perception, I think, within China. So for example, what's striking about the sort of last two rounds in 2010 and 2012, there is also a perception within China, and these sentiments, I think, are shared and also expressed fairly openly, for example, by prominent faculty, to say that, Japan is far more dependent on China. So China can try to use economics to coerce Japan to change its behavior. So again, this is, so this is a kind of thing that, Japan is trying to deal with. Finally, there is the issue of environmental impact. And so the so-called the Asian dust, in which a kind of, or yellow sand is the direct translation in Japanese, the huangsha is, goes from the inland of China, goes through the manufacturing areas, the farming areas, carrying with it pollutants and pesticides and bacteria and all other wonderful things, and now descending upon Japan. For Japanese perspective, we know that this is a far more bigger issue in China, and this is something that Japan must work on. And so, for example, in terms of trying to deal with this issue, that there was for the first time a bilateral meeting recently between the environmental and foreign ministry officials on the one hand in Japan and also their counterparts in China. So again, this is something that you could distrust China, but Japan really given the geography and given its relationship, that Japan really has, I think, no option but to try to engage and work with China. Final thing, I'll go through this very quickly. Sort of the recent territorial dispute politicized significantly, intensely in 2010, and then militarized increasingly since 2012. And part of this has to do with a very important domestic political turmoil within Japan, in which under Prime Minister Hatoyama, and then with Ichiro Ozawa's visit, the delegation in Beijing in December 2009, there was a sense in which Japan was tilting towards China and being away from the United States. And I'm not a DPJ basher, but I don't think this is very strategic with regards to sort of working with China, because it created uncertainty in U.S.-Japan alliance, and also sort of, DPJ was just not very clear what the intent of these kinds of visit was. I would argue that much of the 2010 Corolla collision, in which those three officials listed there, the Prime Minister, the Chief Cabinet Secretary, the CCS, and the Minister of Land, Infrastructure, Transport Minister. And also, I would argue that the most recent, we all wish that Governor Shintaro Ishihara did not exist, or that he didn't have as much influence, but he did in this case, and so he is not the landowner, he is not the owner of the 3 out of the 5 islands. He is the spokesperson, the brother, in which the Prime Minister Noda's government made a decision that they had to deal with the issue at the central government level. And so all of this actually is mired in domestic politics, which actually then makes it difficult to build what you might call strategic trust. I'll skip that, that's fine. Let me end by, not that. although we could talk about that too. Anyways, I will just finish by saying this issue of strategic trust. Of course, the main issue is the issue of history between China and Japan for the Chinese, okay? And my view about Japan's history problem is, of course, in terms of, for example, Prime Minister's visit to the Yasukuni Shrine. I'm against it on a moral grounds, of course, but I also don't think that it's strategic for Japan. It's not strategic for Japan for Japanese prime ministers to visit the Yasukuni Shrine because it enables China to historicize various issues. It enables China to criticize Japan. So, of course, on moral grounds, I'm against it, but I also don't think it's in Japan's national interest. Abe, because of his conservative political instincts, I think will visit the Yasukuni Shrine. Possibly in the summer, we don't know, but I think he will. And I'm not the biggest fan of the prime minister. I think he's been, in terms of his revisionist view of history, I think he has done well so far, but we'll have to see what happens in the upper house election in July. Thanks. Yeah.
Should we come? Okay.
Before I open up the floor to questions, I would like to give the speakers a chance, if they have any questions, to ask each other questions and start some discussion. Does anyone have questions for their fellow panelists?
I think we should open it up.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay. Yeah, do you have a question?
Thank you. Just a brief remark. I mentioned aircraft carriers, and we are now fascinated by the Chinese having a carrier bought secondhand from the Russians. We, the United States Navy, have 11 carriers, and there's no comparison. Even if the one that China owns and operates now is modern in a way, but it's not a carrier which can carry 90,000 aircraft, costs in addition to the 8 billion, 20,000 with aircraft to operate. I mean, there's a major difference, and the Chinese give no indication that they will ever build one of these huge carriers. They couldn't operate it, they couldn't build it, they now know how it's not there yet. So we shouldn't concentrate on capabilities. We should more concentrate.
So does anyone from the audience have questions? You can, yeah, go ahead.
Well, on that point, one of the we talk a lot about American exceptionalism and how, and as I mentioned, how American policymakers and many American citizens regard our norms and our values as universal. But there's a counterpart in China, in modern, and I wouldn't even say not only in modern China, but also in China more generally. And I think that we should keep in mind that when we talk about the exceptionalism of our values, Chinese citizens kind of raise their hands and say, well, we've been around for a little bit longer. The United States has been around for approximately 250 years. China has been around for, depending on who you ask, their recorded history is 4 millennia or 5 millennia, so a totally different order of magnitude. And the Chinese have very different values that in their own regard, or in their own right, regard as perhaps not universal, but as sensible and as prudent. I think that the difference between, so one of those core values which actually has been problematic for Chinese foreign policy is the importance of non-intervention in the affairs of other countries. One of the difficulties of a China that needs to go across the world, so China says don't intervene in other countries' affairs, don't intervene in other countries' affairs. The problem is that in order to sustain a 7 to 8% rate of growth for a population of 1.34 billion people, if you have to go across the world and negotiating agreements wherever you can, by definition, you have to intervene at least lightly in the affairs of other countries. So I think that one of the big adjustments for China is how to reconcile long-standing values such as non-intervention, which I would say is a core, at least a core diplomatic value, if not a core Chinese sort of civilizational value. How to reconcile that value with the imperatives of Chinese domestic policy. But I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about American exceptionalism, there's nothing wrong with upholding our values. There's nothing wrong with, I mean, every country upholds its values. Every country promulgates them. But we should recognize that the Chinese are a very proud people, a very proud country, and I think that they would regard themselves as a proud civilization. So they have their own variant of exceptionalism that even if we don't agree with, we should at least dignify and appreciate.
Fine.
Yes, go ahead.
Person
I'm not an expert on that. I think what I would say, there is a discussion about the Japanese perspectives on this, is they do try to see, what exactly are the mechanisms through which the anti-Japanese protests are being done. And I think they observe that it's they could be both government directed but also very spontaneous. But also, they've also found some pretty cynical Twitters and social media saying that this whole islands issue is that Chinese government they don't care about this issue. They care much more about real economic issues. And so I think I'll just leave it at that. But
just to add a comment, I would say that what China has articulated what you could call, maybe not explicitly, but an implicit bargain with the Chinese people since it embarked on market reforms in the late 70s. And that implicit agreement is that if you don't interfere too much with the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, if you don't threaten its autonomy and its authority, we will consistently deliver to you, your family, and your next generations a high rate of growth. We'll lift you out of poverty. And keep in mind, it's one of these statistics that just I can never fully wrap my head around it. Between 1981 and 2005, according to the World Bank, China lifted 600 million people out of poverty. It's an extraordinary achievement. It's unrivaled in, I shouldn't even say unrivaled in human history. That's not doing it justice. It hasn't even been approached in human history. So what China has been able to do is, it's allowed, and we got at this yesterday with the first panel, I think that China, it offers enough of a steam valve, or enough of a release valve, I should say, whether it's through microblogging services. It offers enough of a release valve so that citizens feel like they can protest. And it's not and the Chinese government is aware of protests on environmental issues, and actually in certain numbers of instances has actually been responsive to public grievances. So I don't think that we should argue that China is totally unresponsive. On the other hand, I think that because it has allowed, this was a point made yesterday, because it's allowed, on the one hand, enough of a release valve where people feel like they can get their grievances off their chest, and because China has year after year defied expectations and continued to grow at 7 or 8% and lift people out of poverty and into the middle class, my argument would be that there hasn't really been enough of a foundation for some kind of collective, like a Chinese Spring. There was an argument when the Arab Spring happened that maybe there will be a Chinese Spring. So far, it hasn't happened. The question, I think, for the Chinese government will be, as more and more Chinese enter the middle class, when you're poor, you want food on the table. You want water on the table. You're thinking about basic necessities. But once you have those basic necessities and you enter the middle class, and your situation isn't as urgent and existential, then you begin to want to have a little bit more of a say in what the government's policies are. And so I think the question is, China wants to build its middle class, but China also recognizes that this burgeoning, newly empowered middle class also will increasingly criticize government policy. So the question is if it can reconcile those two imperatives.
More questions from the floor. Professor DeLeo.
I guess on my part, that's a big question, and I think I forgot to mention a few things. I mean, I think one is that when Premier Wen Jiabao went to Tokyo in May of 2007, and when President Hu Jintao went to Tokyo, first time in 10 years, April of 2007, and then this was May of 2008. So the first time since President Jiang Zemin in October 1998, that they really did express not to appreciation, but they recognized, this is also very important, they recognized that Japan has made an effort. Japan recognized its historical responsibility. I mean, there's an exact wording for this. And I think that was also, as a will and a gesture of kind of trust building, I think was very important. Again, with all of East China stuff now, it's kind of, we tend to forget this. And so I think that there have been these efforts. I think what happened in the territorial sort of issue, and the way I've heard sort of my Chinese counterparts tell me, is that all really ended in 2010. And since 2010, basically, the Chinese perception is that we've really made an effort from 2006 through 2010, and then you've destroyed it. And so I think that, so in that sense, it was a fragile effort, I think. The other thing I would say in terms of hotline is, the other thing that's not widely reported is that in May of 2012, there actually was, for the first time, bilateral China-Japan meeting in Hangzhou between the defense and foreign ministry and maritime agencies of both countries. Not that many records, public records or statements, but that did take place, and that was an effort to try to deal with these crisis situations. They were supposed to meet again in the fall, but because of the political problem. So ultimately, it's a political issue, but I think that we also should not forget about these efforts. And they did take place during the time of China's rise. So.
For the questions that you posed to me, I concede your first point, and I think that I should have been more nuanced in illuminating this asymmetry in perceptions. That you had argued that China has regarded its relationship with the United States as its most consequential bilateral relationship for a longer period of time than the other way around, and I think that characterization is certainly accurate, and I should have been more careful in my own characterization. For the second question you raised, I think that there's an interesting, you sort of raised a distinction between will and capacity, and I'm really glad that you brought up that point, because it actually gets at something that I wanted to talk about in my remarks but didn't have time to. So as part of the book, which Rithwik kindly mentioned, I had the opportunity to travel to Singapore a few times with Graham Allison and Robert Blackwell to interview Lee Kuan Yew. He's the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, and it has been its guiding light since. And I would say that probably the world over, outside of Henry Kissinger, he's probably the most respected China watcher. And in fact, Henry Kissinger says, I've learned, and he says this in the foreword, Kissinger says, I've learned more from Lee Kuan Yew than from any other world leader I've ever interacted with. So big statement, big idea. We asked Lee Kuan Yew, and it's the first question that we ask him in the book. We say, do you believe that the Chinese leadership is serious about displacing the United States as the world's leading power, first in the Asia-Pacific and in time the world? And his response is pretty provocative. He says, of course. He says, why not? He says, they're a proud country, civilization. They have 1.3 billion people, many of whom are enormously talented. They've been able to replicate many American achievements. And they're growing at a rate that was unimaginable 50 years ago. Why not? But then if you ask him the related question, which gets to your distinction between will and capacity, will China actually, in fact, become number one? There he hedges his bets a little bit more. So we actually, in the book, we compile a number of assessments that he offered in response to that question. Some of his assessments seem to be a bit more confident about the possibility of China's becoming number one. But he's also very candid about the obstacles that it faces. Not only environmental degradation, corruption, and many of the challenges that have been discussed, but he also talks about the importance of language. He says that one of the reasons that the United States has historically been able to attract and assimilate talent so well is that the English language relative to Chinese is far easier to learn. He says it's very difficult. So if you come to the United States and if you take an intensive, English immersion course, you can at least get to baseline proficiency, reasonably quickly. You can't just go to China, spend a few months there, and hope now I'm a Chinese citizen. I'm an assimilated Chinese citizen. So Lee Kuan Yew says, absolutely. Do they want to displace the U.S.? Absolutely. Why not? Whether they'll actually be able to do so is another question.
Just a couple more questions. Go ahead, Will.
Great question. I would reformulate a little bit. I mean, Abe has a revisionist view of history. He comes from a political family which is very conservative, and of course he's the grandson of former Prime Minister Kishi, who served in a Tojo cabinet in the 1930s and 40s. But what's interesting about Abe, so this is the question that everyone's asking, the question that you asked, which is that he was actually quite, we might call strategic from 06 to 07. And actually China does recognize that he did reset Japan-China relations after 5 years of Koizumi visiting the Yasukuni Shrine every year. Now, Abe got sick, okay? So he couldn't serve more than 1 year. And he has gone on public record saying that he regrets not being able to visit the Yasukuni Shrine. So I think that's the fundamental issue with him, that I think right now, he has been strategic. I guess the other thing I would sort of add is he has bought into this idea of value-based diplomacy. That is to kind of, not necessarily counter, but deal with China. You have to emphasize democracy, rule of law, and human rights. You have to work with democratic countries in Southeast Asia. He just visited Mongolia recently, a couple of days ago or something. So that is and that is actually a balancing act against China. But again, if you have a revisionist view of history, there is a contradiction there. So I think that's the main question. My point would be that his revisionist view of history leads to your kind of question, which is that somehow Japan is becoming this big military power. The answer is no, okay? So, they did sort of 0.8% or something. They did increase the defense budget, but it's not, Japan's military budget is far smaller than China's, okay? So there's this view that somehow, Japan's becoming nationalist, or Japan's military is this problem. Okay, so we have problems, but I think that kind of perception, Abe's view of history leads to that kind of perception, which I think is not strategic for Japan.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you for pointing out a problems in my home country's democracy. And that is a problem. 7 prime ministers in the 2000s. This is kind of an increasing trend. We seem to actually have, actually maybe even more, sorry. I may have gotten that wrong. I meant to say I think 7 elections, upper house and lower house elections. And so I think Japan has too many elections. Upper house and lower house has completely different calendars. And so for a variety of reasons, we don't really seem to have a kind of a stable prime minister. And I think that I think is a very important issue. The honest answer is I don't know, and I think that I think Abe has the opportunity to serve in the long run. As I said, I think I'm not the biggest fan of Abe per se, but in terms of foreign policy and having a stable government, I think it is a good thing to have stable government. And I think that does have some impact on China-Japan relations, but that is a problem because no one remembers it's not just prime minister actually, by the way, defense minister, foreign minister, they all kind of change because of scandals and other reasons, and people can't keep track. So that's a problem.
With that, we're going to wrap up this panel. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel of speakers for coming out today.
Thanks.